Hey everyone, this is going to be my detailed explanation video on how I built this BitFenix Prodigy M case with SLI and custom water-cooled components. I have two other videos on my channel. One is the breakdown of the case so you can see all the components of it, and then the other is the time-lapse video of me putting together the computer from start to finish. I wanted to film a third video and break down in more detail some of the harder aspects of building this rig to help anybody else out who might have similar case and wants to do a similar build, particularly with the SLI and the two radiators is what really added to the challenge of this video. So there's practically no space left over in the case, considering the two cards and the two radiators, and I had to make quite a few modifications to the system to even be able to build it the way it is. So we'll start by going through all the components that are in the system, starting with the case. It's the BitFenix Prodigy M case, which is a MATX case or mini ITX case. It is pretty small compared to other MATX cases, and you'll see that as we go through the build. So I have two 980 Ti hydrocopper graphics cards. These are the same ones that were in my last build. One thing to note about this case is the motherboard tray is inverted, so everything is upside down compared to how most computers are, and you'll see more about that as we go through it. So the water cooling gear for the pump down here, we have it's the Lang DDC pump with Koolance top and reservoir. I had D5s in my older builds, which are quite a bit bigger than this one and wouldn't really fit in this case. So the DDC pump is a smaller but equally capable pump as the D5. So for the radiators, they're both from Alphacool. The one in the back here is 140 millimeter, 45 millimeters thick, and then there's one on the top here that you'll see, which is a 30 mil dual 120 radiator. The motherboard is the ASUS Gen 8, and the CPU is the Intel i7 6700K. We have the power supply in the front here. This is the EVGA 1000 PS, which is the same power supply in my previous build. Although you can see here it's turned on its side, which takes up quite a bit of space in the computer. The fans are all Noctua, so I have one fan in the back here. It's 140 mil to go with the radiator. Noctua NF A14, I think is what it's called. And then in the top, I have two NFF12 fans. The memory is Corsair Vengeance DDR4. 32 gigabytes in the back there. The SSDs, I have two 840 Pro SSDs on the back panel. Those are the same as the previous build, as well as one Western Digital 4 terabyte drive, which is on the bottom here. So I'll go over the flow that the water takes through the water cooling components. We'll start here with the pump res combo. This is a Koolance 80 mil height res, and then the DDC pump combo here comes out of this port here through this tube into the rear radiator, which is 140 mil, 45 mil thick. It goes through that radiator, up out of the top of it into this tube, and then up that tube into the dual 120 radiator, which is actually on the top of the computer outside of the case. It goes through that radiator and then back down into the case through this tube here into the top GPU. So it goes through the GPUs, and then I have two SLI fittings in between the GPUs here. So it goes through both graphics cards, out of the bottom one here, down into the CPU. The CPU block is also from Koolance, and then out of the CPU block through this tube, and then back down into the pump. So I also have a drain valve on this computer, and it comes out of the 140 mil radiator. This radiator has multiple ports on it, actually. You can see the one here that I'm using, and then the one on the top that I'm using. And then in the back there's also one on that same side, and then it also has ports on the top of the radiator, or the bottom in this case, because of how it's positioned. So my drain port goes through, out of the radiator down there, through a hole in the case to the bottom of the case. So here you can see the drain port underneath the case. It's a 90-degree fitting that comes out of the bottom of the radiator. It's a swivel 90-degree fitting, and then straight into a on-off valve, which fits perfectly in between the bottom leg or foot of the case and the bottom of the case. So it swivels left and right, and I have a cap on the end here. So I unscrew the cap, add a tubing to the end of it, turn the valve, and I can drain the computer out of the very bottom of the water cooling setup. So I'll go over the several case modifications I had to make in order to fit all these components in. You can see them in the time-lapse video that I made of the build, but I'll just go through them in more detail here. So starting with the hard drive cages, there were vertical hard drive cages that were right here, and then another one on the back panel, or excuse me, the side panel. So I had to remove those, obviously. I also had to remove the 5 1/4 inch bay bracket So up here behind the 5 1/4 inch bay, there was a metal bracket that would actually hold the CD-ROM or whatever you put in there. It would hold that up. So I removed that so that I could move my side I/O panel to the front. I also made adjustments to the front 5 1/4 inch bay. So the front bay here, this is the cover if you were to not use the 5 1/4 inch bay, if you were not to put anything inside it. So what I did was I moved my side I/O panel to the front here. I also made some slight modifications to this cover here. So I cut off the half of the tab here for the screw that would hold this bracket in place. And on this side, I cut off completely the tab. I also added a small, very small notch here on the corner so that I could fit a fingernail into it in order to basically pry this cover out of the front panel. So it still goes back into the front panel using that little piece of plastic there, slides in to the screws that are halfway screwed in, and then the other side just pops in. So it looks, you can't really tell that it's not screwed in. It still looks pretty good the way it is, and it covers the front buttons pretty well. So this front I/O panel, this metal bracket here is actually removable, and you would remove it if you were to install a CD-ROM or something into the 5 1/4 inch bay. It actually, you break the metal and just take it completely out. So I obviously didn't want to do that because I moved my buttons to the front here. So I left this bracket in, and you can see in the time-lapse build where I cut these holes out. So I essentially cut these holes out where these buttons, the audio jacks, and then these USB ports, where those would be. I cut holes in it. And then use zip ties, which you can see me put together in the time-lapse build. Use zip ties to basically zip tie the I/O panel to this piece of metal so that I could access it. It looks kind of janky, but it actually works pretty well. It doesn't move. I've even used these USB ports. It is strong enough to put a USB stick in and then pull it out. So it's not going anywhere. And like I said before, I can cover it up with the panel here. When the computer's on, the LEDs still show through the panel, which is kind of nice. So you can see when the computer is on or asleep. And then whenever I need to restart the computer or hit the power button, I pry this bracket out, which it does take 2 hands, unfortunately. So I also made some changes to the top of the case. I cut off a metal tab basically that was right here in the top of the case. It was used to secure basically the filter that went on the top of the case. The idea being that your 2 fans go inside the case and then the filter would go on the top. So I cut out that metal tab so that I could place this radiator down onto the top of the case with the ports going down into the case. So I have 2 120 mil fans on the top radiator, right inside the case with the radiator on the outside of the case. There is maybe an inch of clearance between the fans and the top radiator. When I first bought the case and started planning this build, I wondered if I could fit the fans and the radiator inside of the case, and there's just not enough space to do that. I tested it with thin, I guess like 12 mil fans that were also, they weren't good enough, and with the radiator on the inside of the case and the thin low profile fans, there was still only maybe a couple millimeters of clearance there, and I decided I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to use those low grade fans, not good for going against a radiator. So I decided to move the radiator to the outside of the case, and that one tab I had to cut off was really the only modification I had to make to get that radiator on the outside. So there's a decent amount of space there between the top GPU and the fans. Now, one thing to note is there is a tight bend here. From this tube here, you can't see it, but in the back of the back behind it is where it goes up into the top radiator, and then it comes down here and kind of does a 90-degree turn here and goes into this fitting here. Now, in the time-lapse build of this computer, there's a different fitting here. I went with a traditional 90-degree fitting similar to the other ones that was actually too tight of a turn, and it started leaking almost immediately after I built the computer. So I found this special fitting here from Koolance. This is basically a low profile fitting, so it's very thin. It doesn't have the extra, I guess the extra like piece that a traditional 90 degree fitting would have. So it's very small, and it fits in the gap here between the fan and the top GPU. So that fitting there is from Koolance. It's a low profile fitting. I've had no problems since then or leaks out of that fitting there. Another thing to note is the types of fittings I used in this build. I've mentioned it in my previous videos, but when you're building a computer this small, you have such tight tubing runs and you have such limited space that you really need to use fittings that are already angled to kind of help out with your tubing runs so that they don't have to be as tight. So this one here, this is a 45-degree fitting out of the GPU here. I also use a 45-degree fitting in the top radiator, the one that you can't see in the back here. So there's a 45-degree fitting coming out of the radiator to kind of angle the tube down towards this top GPU, but not straight down, and then not a 90-degree angle either, which would obviously aim it towards the side panel here. So that 45-degree fitting in the back there is pretty much required to get that tubing down under the fans and be able to curve around into the top GPU here. I have just straight fittings here and here because those two ports pretty much line up perfectly. And then straight fittings here and here, those ports also line up. 45-degree here as well to help angle that tube up towards the GPU without having to bend it so much. So the hardest part about this build was probably the power supply and the cables that I had to make in order to save space, basically. This power supply is 1,000 watt, partly because I have two graphics cards and I wanted to make sure I had enough juice. So this power supply barely fits into this case with the length of the GPUs. So as you can see here, these 980 Ti's actually extend over top of the power supply there. So what I had to do was basically turn around the power supply from how it was, how it's intended to go in. The fan of the power supply faces into the computer there, and the design is actually for the power supply to be flipped around and the fan to face the front of the case. But if I had done that, then the cables basically coming out of the module power supply would they'd be in the way of the graphics card there. So I had to turn around the PSU. One thing to note doing that is the bracket here is designed for the power supply to be facing the other way, like I said. So I had to actually cut off these. There was little pieces of metal here that extended from the bracket here. I had to cut them out or cut them off in order to turn the power supply around. It doesn't affect anything. The power supply is still screwed into the bracket, and the bracket is still able to screw into the bottom of the case. Now, these cables are, I custom made these cables as well as the main 24-pin motherboard cable in the back here. I had no space. I expected to have no space with all these components in here, so I knew I would need to save it with cables. These cables here, basically I made them just long enough to go from the PSU straight into the video cards, because otherwise there'd be no other place for the cables to go. So here's the other side panel of the case where you can see the power cables. This is the 24-pin motherboard cable here, and it basically also goes straight from the PSU down around this bend here into the motherboard. You can see there's not really any other space here to bunch up cables. The cables that are here that you can see, they're all pretty much just as long as they need to be in order to get to their component. So if you're going to do a similar build like this, I really would have to recommend either finding shorter cables or having custom ones made so that you basically have enough space to put all these cables in. I'm also using the low profile the thin SATA cables for the two SSDs that I've used in my previous builds. Another cable modification I made is to the front USB ports. This cable here is the front USB panel, and then it goes down into the motherboard header. The cable that came with the case was very longer than it would need to be. They obviously didn't make or have made a shorter USB 3.0 cable for this case, unfortunately. So it was so long that I basically bought this cord here. I just bought it online and then connected it to this front panel using the original screws and some zip ties and some hot glue in order to get that front USB connector. Some other things to note are the pump and the bottom hard drive are screwed in to the bottom of the case with 2 screws each. They go through these holes that are in the bottom of the case for fans or for airflow. The screws that came with the pump and the screws that came with the hard drive actually fit right through those holes, so that was convenient that they were able to screw in there. So here's the bottom of the case. You can see here the power supply and this core. You have to kind of turn it around in order to get it to plug into the power supply when you turn the power supply around and have it positioned the way I do. Here are the two screws for the pump, and then the hard drive here and here. Another thing to note is the clearance here between the GPU and the radiator. There's about maybe 1 millimeter of clearance there, given the size of the radiator. So some radiators, either the 120 or the 140 size, they all have some extra width basically for space for the cooling or the fins or whatever. So make note of that with whatever radiator you would put on the back of this case. The bottom part extends even more, so below the actual 140 millimeter part of the radiator. So this where these ports are here, the radiator wouldn't be able to be flipped the other way because there's not enough space up here for them to go. So this is the only way the radiator would fit inside this case, and it just barely fits under that GPU. So I've also installed an extra 4 USB port on the back of the computer here. There's barely enough space for the cabling that comes out of that back bracket with the fans and the radiator where they are. So I had to cut them a little bit and use some zip ties to kind of angle them out of the way so that they could then go back behind along the side of the radiator and the fans and plug into the motherboard in the back there. I also added some electrical tape to the holes on the side panel where the I/O panel would originally go, just to kind of cover them up so you can't see through them and so that dust cannot get in. So that about wraps up my explanation of how I fit these components into this case. BitFenix has 1 or 2 other cases that are basically or similar layout on the inside, and they just look different on the outside. So this type of setup could work in some of those other cases from BitFenix. The main thing to remember is that you're going to need either shorter or custom cables to save space, as well as short tubing runs to save space. And then the power supply is also another issue depending on how tall your power supply is. And then of course also the top radiator, if you want to have a radiator up there, it'll have to go on the outside of the case if you have 2 graphics cards. If I only had 1 graphics card, if this one was not here, then there would be enough space inside to have the fan and the radiator inside the case. But I wanted to go SLI, so that's why the radiator has to go on the outside. I suggest watching the time-lapse video of the build so that you can see how all the components go together. It's kind of hard to show it here now that it's built, just because of how tight and how close everything is. It's hard to get the camera and the light in there in order to show all of it. So if you can watch the other time-lapse video and this one, and if you have any specific questions on how I fit things together, post it down in the comments and I'll let you know how I put it together. My next build is actually going to be an even smaller case. However, I'm not going to do SLI anymore, given the current state of SLI with NVIDIA. It's almost too much hassle for what it's worth these days. So my next build will not be SLI, but it will be a smaller case, and it will still have custom water cooling components. So go ahead and hit subscribe so that you can see that video when it comes out later. And other than that, thanks for watching.